executive director of the Project for Study of the 21st Century. Here for a panel this evening to talk about Future of NATO. We've got a great panel, Robbie from the Transatlantic Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council, and Rachel Rizzo, Research Associate at the Center for a New American Security. Both, I'd like to say, recently, matter of hours ago, in the case of Robbie, returned from Europe. Are we up, Chris? So I wanted to start with you, Rachel, because you've been on the eastern edge in the Baltics most recently. I mean, there is a kind of air of danger and edge to Europe, particularly in that part of it that hasn't been there for a long time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in the last few years, especially since the activities of Russia in eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, the Russian threat is kind of seen as a bigger deal as it once was. I mean, the whole point of NATO was originally created as a stand against the Soviet Union in 67 years ago, I think it was. And then after the Cold War, when that went away, NATO kind of had to rethink its strategy and rethink its what its goals were. And so I think in 2014 with Crimea and eastern Ukraine, that kind of brought the Russian threat and a revanchist Russia back into the fold, and that's people are talking about it now, especially Poland and especially the Baltics. It's a bigger deal than it once was.
I mean, Robbie, from the perspective of Washington, Europe is not at the top of the list, maybe it's much higher up than it was.
So it depends who you ask, but the short answer is yes. I think this administration has been very focused on threats in the Middle East, and especially the so-called pivot to Asia, as it has been called. So there was a bit of reluctance coming to bolster European defense. I think there's a prevailing sentiment in Washington that Europeans aren't bankrolling their own defense, so why should we bother doing that? And you've seen that reflected in some of the campaign rhetoric, particularly with Donald Trump, who has openly questioned the need for NATO, which is really unprecedented in the nearly 70 years that NATO's been around. But you've seen new manifestations in American commitment to European security, primarily through what's called the European Reassurance Initiative, which is a big defense spending package. That in the year 2015, after the onset of the crisis, the Ukraine crisis, Russia's revanchism, as Rachel expertly outlined, it was less than $1 billion, and it was just announced recently this year that they're tripling that. So you are seeing a sort of slow reluctance and a slow realization that.
And what that really means is more boots and kit on the ground, and more visit with U.S. presidents heavily.
It does, but you also shouldn't I guess ignore the fact that there's more political on the ground presence in Europe, which is it's very diffuse, but it can be felt.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, also with ERI, I mean, going from $789 million up to $3.4 billion. That's not primarily for boots on the ground. It's mostly for pre-positioned equipment, training. I think some of the funding is going to go for a BCT that's rotational. So we have two, and then we'll add one more that's Brigade Combat Team. Yeah. So the bulk of the funding is going to these three brigade combat teams rotating through. And what you'll hear the administration say is, oh, this is all for Eastern Europe, but actually they're going to be based in Germany. And if, let's say there's a rapidly developing crisis in the Baltics or Poland, it's going to take a minimum of 40 days to get those BCTs over there. So it's a good start, but it's not a fix-all. Yeah.
I mean, when you guys have been in Warsaw and the Baltics, when people look at Trump and they hear particularly the anti-NATO rhetoric of Trump, what kind of impact does that have?
I mean,
because they've never heard anything like that.
Right? Exactly. I think the question that you get is this really how America feels about its allies? You spend a lot of time reassuring them that no, the majority of Americans, we understand that the United States plays a large role in European security, and we want to make sure that the Europeans are contributing to that as well. But a lot of it was reassuring people that the majority of Americans, love our allies. We like the fact that we're partners with Europe. I think that a lot of it wasn't like an apology tour, but it was like, don't worry, not everyone thinks this. It's had an effect. And people are concerned about Trump's presidency. Do we really think that Trump can be president? A year ago, you probably would have laughed at that idea, but now it's real. So, yeah.
You're also, some of that rhetoric is already seeping into the rest of the mainstream. When the NATO Secretary General was here a month or so ago, he had a bunch of senators echoing Trump lines at him. Europe isn't contributing enough. It has changed the mood music slightly.
So it has, but I actually disagree with Rachel a bit. I think most Americans don't think about NATO. We're in a bubble here in Washington. We wish they would, but most Americans don't think of NATO. And what they do think is, if you ask the average person walking down the street in California or Idaho or Texas, if they have any thoughts on it, it essentially reflects what Trump has said. So
that was going to be my next sentence.
Yeah.
While the United States government and sort of wider think tankerati not least it's just like it's Council of State and
bias.
That's incredibly atypical of America, right?
Yeah, it is, and there's so Trump has really tapped into a vein of disillusionment, which is one small facet of his wider view on how the world works, and that America is caught footing the bill a lot of the times, and others are free riding, and it's time to let America start winning. So the bottom line is, no matter how ridiculous that is or how it plays out in the foreign policy realm, he's really tapped into a seam of American political support, and NATO has unfortunately become a target of that. But in what you're referencing to with the senators, it's that closed-door meeting. A lot of the NATO Secretary General was on the side of those senators. The NATO Secretary General is harping as much as any American political leader to say, we need to spend 2%, we need to match American defense capabilities. So in some ways, those headlines were just a little bit misleading, because it made it seem like the American senators were really, lecturing in a really negative way the Secretary General, when in reality they were in complete agreement, and the Secretary General's team actually thought it was really helpful, and it gave them some good political capital to go back to Brussels and show Europeans that Americans were really starting to pay attention to their defense.
At the end of the day, if you want the polls or the bolts, NATO is the first, last, and almost only bit of your defense plan, right? There is no plan B for NATO not existing, or NATO being thinned back as Trump would like to see it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that the Baltic security and NATO are one and the same, and potential for him. And and sometimes that, I think a lot of people will see that as Baltic security with being protected by America is also one of the same, which I don't 100% agree with. But yeah, I think that if you're the Balts, you want to make sure that that NATO is backed by the strength of the United States and the funding that it needs and the capabilities that it needs to protect Baltic territory. And I think that there's a question sometimes of whether or not that would actually happen in the face of some sort of surprise aggression or surprise threat.
And how is NATO affected by the various other bits of European crisis that are going on? The migrant crisis, the ongoing trouble over the euro, the long-term future of the European Union, potential Brexit. NATO in some ways looks the strong bit. The other bits look even dodgier. Does that have a knock-on effect on NATO?
I think so. I think when it comes to NATO, one of the most important things right now is alliance cohesion and making sure that everyone is on the same page when it comes to a NATO strategy or their Article 5 commitments. But then when you look at NATO South, their threat perception probably looks much different than NATO's East, because they're dealing with they have to deal more with the migration crisis, whereas the eastern flank and the Baltics don't have to deal with that as much right now. So I think that when facing a litany of threats, when it comes to not just Russia, a Middle East that's in turmoil, that's causing a migration crisis, that in turn has a knock-on effect on NATO and alliance cohesion, which I think is really important.
Talk me through what's actually happening in the Baltics. I mean, we've seen these flybys by Russian aircraft and Russian aircraft are doing things. What exactly are the Russians doing? What are people worried that they're doing?
I mean, I would. There hasn't been anything serious that has happened. But I think what the question is if there was some sort of if there was another Crimea or if there was another Eastern Ukraine, where would that take place? And the answer for a lot of people is in the Baltics. So I mean, there are some issues. I mean, the plane flyby a couple weeks ago. I mean, as we were talking about before we started here, was probably a lone pilot who decided to do something crazy and see how people would react to it and see if they could get a reaction. But as far as like an immediate threat goes, I'm on this side that there isn't one, but you can never be too prepared. And if you're the Baltics, that is something that you need to be prepared for. You could maybe have a different.
Russia's aim in the Baltics is all of these are means to an end to showcase cracks and fissures in NATO unity.
Absolutely.
So it's it's not about they're preparing to invade Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. They're preparing to grab Tallinn and to turn it into the new Russian state, a la Crimea. This is all to showcase that NATO is weak and Russia is strong, and all of these little pressure points that they're poking that NATO is not responding to sort of adds and builds to that narrative. I think there are a lot of analogies that many transatlantic policymakers make between Crimea or Eastern Ukraine and Eastern Estonia, Latvia, the so-called hybrid warfare, the little green men scenario that I'm sure everyone has heard about. And the bottom line is that's really very unlikely.
And there's a fear rather than there's no evidence that this is actually happening.
Yeah,
it's a fear.
Yeah, but it's a fear that's somewhat overblown and perpetuated by people who don't fully understand the region. I mean, Ukraine had a very weak sense of nationhood before the onset of the crisis. But Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all have Russian-speaking minorities that some say are sort of a fifth column for Russian subversion in the area, but that's not true. They're very well integrated, and even if they watch this high quality Russian propaganda, which is an issue, all they have to do is look over the border and see how life is there versus life on their side of the border, and you won't see that. And another point on Crimea is for decades Russia has, and then before that the Soviet Union had 25,000 troops stationed there. So taking Crimea was a pub crawl. They already had 25,000 troops stationed there. And the fact that they got bogged down by the Ukrainian army, which is a very corrupt, sclerotic, legacy of the Soviet Union, the fact that they were bogged down shows that they really don't have as strong a military as NATO. So I don't think my whole rant there is I don't think people should be as worried about the Balts as or comparing it to Ukraine.
But if you're the Balts, they would disagree.
I mean, for the Balts, it's an existential threat, right? In a way that it isn't if you're Italy, most of the rest of the alliance.
Yeah, it's an existential threat, but they will be the first to tell you that this new phrase "little green men" won't apply to them, or they're not the next Ukraine in the sense that Russia can just roll them back without a fight.
I mean, they also need to be careful here, right? Because one of the risks is that you over-militarize the city. If you start treating the Russian speaking population as the enemy, then that is exactly what they will become. And I get the impression the Balts are very aware of that, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you talk to government officials from the Baltics, they're very clear in that the Russian-speaking minority, the Russian-speaking population is very well integrated. They're part of the government. They're part of the decision-making process, and that's something that they try to drive home all the time. So I don't think that the militarization line has been crossed yet. And if it was, that would be a huge problem.
Switching flanks slightly. I mean, Turkey has its own very specific territorial issues at the moment. And Turkey is, of course, a member state, albeit one that seems to have been sort of left out rather more on one limb than the Baltics. The Baltics are back to the hilt, whereas Turkey, for a variety of reasons, seems to be sort of half in, half out. Does that seem a fair, if overly simplistic?
So Turkey, of course, is a member of NATO, but not the EU, which has been a real sticking point in NATO-EU relations. But I think Turkey has always been seen as sort of in a way, a red-headed stepchild of the alliance. Some Europeans will say it's not a part of Europe. A very large majority Muslim population that bridges Europe and the Middle East. And so in that sense, I think politically it has become a bit unmoored from the alliance, particularly because of the really difficult political situation and the dismantling of democracy that Erdogan is undertaking. But it's still a big, geopolitical heavyweight in NATO, and NATO needs Turkey. And so I think militarily it will be really difficult for NATO to brush Turkey aside as an ally. And in fact, NATO has a lot of very important basing infrastructure in Turkey. That's
Which
now
is vital to the Syrian war.
Yeah, that's now being used in the anti-ISIL campaign.
And when it comes to Europe's migrant crisis as well, I mean, there's an agreement between the EU and Turkey that they'll take X number of migrants. So it just goes to show that while they may not be a member of the EU, they are an integral part of the European continent and kind of trying to alleviate some of that pressure from the Europeans. And that's important to NATO as well.
I mean, do we think NATO has moved on from being the expeditionary warfare beast that it was in Afghanistan and Libya, where it was used as the structure for doing that? It strikes me that it's transitioned fairly abruptly back to its original purpose in the last couple of years, and it doesn't seem to be discussed. It's not the lead element on fighting ISIS, for example, and no one's really suggested it should be.
No, I mean, anyone that brings up, anyone that asks, I mean, even when the NATO SecGen was here a couple of weeks ago, and the question was posed whether or not NATO will officially enter in as part of the anti-ISIL coalition, he was very adamant in saying, no, that's not going to happen. This is something that individual countries should take on themselves. And I mean, I think that there are only like 3 areas in the world that NATO actually has forces, and that's still in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and then I think fighting piracy is another one. So yeah, I mean, what was that?
Bosnia also.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Bosnia. Yeah. So yeah, I think that it's kind of taken on its role that it was once created for. It's no longer.
And I mean, is that because it doesn't want to do the expeditionary stuff, or just that it's essentially an anti-Russia alliance again?
So I actually disagree a bit. A lot of the talk and focus will be on Russia and the East simply because that's what NATO knows how to do. It can revert back to what it had honed and trained to do for decades. But NATO still has a really important role to play, if not in expeditionary NATO, nation building exercises like in Afghanistan, but definitely in capacity building with partnering nations, North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. It's important to remember that NATO is essentially the Microsoft of the military. It's sort of it allows for an operating system, if you will, a gold standard that all militaries can emulate in terms of training, in terms of doctrine, in terms of the quality and caliber of the troops. So there's a lot of important work that NATO can do for very fledgling and fragile countries from Libya to Tunisia in capacity building that can alleviate that's definitely out of their tradition.
But again, I mean, it hasn't, despite having been the implementing body for the Libya war, it seems to have pulled back very substantially from Libya after the war's conclusion, right?
Well, I don't think I had a real plan of what to do on the. You always say what happens on the day after. I don't think NATO had a clear plan on what to do after the Libyan intervention, and now we're kind of faced with, what do we do? What now?
So I actually disagree. I think to your first point, the Secretary General, when he was here in Washington, said that they're going to be focusing a lot more on capacity building, and that won't grab the headlines. That won't be the 10,000 troops mobilizing to send somewhere, but it will be, smaller, lower key training missions that you'll see a lot more of, especially in places like Libya. And in Libya, NATO was the blunt instrument to conduct the military operation. And so the fact that there was no plan for afterward, I don't think that blame can be placed solely on NATO's shoulders, because they were asked to go in and conduct airstrikes and take out certain targets, and they did that. And after that, it was up to all of the governments, what came next, and that's where they failed. But it wasn't NATO,
which is in some ways always been the flaw of the heart of NATO and the EU, right? NATO isn't actually a thing; it's a club of countries, and the countries are the ones that make the big decisions, and NATO is then left with whatever the kind of, with whatever it can do in the middle.
Yeah.
Which brings, I suppose, to the European politics is complicated, but when we talk about NATO policy, we really mean a White House plus Merkel plus a few others, right? That's really where NATO decision-making really happens.
Yeah, I think when you look at NATO decision-making, it comes down to the United States, France, Germany, the UK. But that's different than, NATO funding. I think that when you look at, people always make the argument like that the decision makers in NATO aren't necessarily the ones that are dedicating 2% of their GDP on defense, and some people see that as kind of an unfair play. But I do think that those 4 countries are the ones that are making the big decisions. I don't know, you may think differently.
The decision-making body of NATO is
it's at 28.
It's 28, and it's unanimous votes. So no matter how hard the United States and Germany and France lobby, and Iceland could potentially veto a NATO action.
How badly would NATO be damaged by a Brexit and a Trump, which are the 2 wild cards that could come out of the rest of this year?
I guess it depends on who you talk to. I think that I personally think that a Brexit could lessen the UK's sway within NATO. It is a body that agrees upon decisions at 28, soon to be 29. But I do think that there are countries within NATO who are seen as powerhouses and who hold a lot of power just because of their political playbooks, the UK being one of them. And I think that a Brexit could have a negative knock-on effect on that.
So I think it will certainly add to the narrative that Europe is weakening, that it's falling apart, that all of these political cracks and fissures are widening. Which is
the Russian game plan and hope.
A Brexit would be great for Putin. But there's some actual real hard defense implications. If a Brexit went through, Scotland would definitely push for another referendum, because one of the main reasons that Scotland essentially stayed in was because it was still part of the EU, and if it had exited, it might have had to reapply for EU membership. And Scotland is the home to one of the backbones of Britain's nuclear trident. And so, a Brexit could, second, third order, lead to Scotland breaking off, and then the UK's nuclear trident suddenly becoming divided between separate sovereign countries. So there are a lot of interesting, what if this actual hard, real military implications.
So there's a lot of talk about, we talked about, General Breedlove was talking about the weaponization of refugees, suggesting that Russia was kind of pouring oil on the Syria war to destabilize Europe. The European Union has its strategic communications task force that spends its entire time pumping out summaries of destabilizing Russian propaganda. To what extent do we think the Russians are deliberately trying to drive the narrative, and to what extent is this just something that kind of organically happens?
I think that it's a balancing act. I think Putin is calculated. I think that he knows what he's doing, and I think that with the Russians, I know they're pulling out some of their military equipment out of Syria, which we'll yet to see what actually happens with that. But I think over the last couple of months, what ended up happening was you had this kind of Russian, disinformation campaign that they were trying to fan the flame, and these kind of anti-immigrant far-right European parties that were kind of a part of that. And then at the same time, you had his involvement in Syria, which was also fanning the flames of the migration crisis. So it was kind of pushing it on both sides.
It looked like the question really is whether you believe it's an evil plan or just a bunch of things that happen to be happening.
I don't necessarily think it's an evil plan, but I don't necessarily think it's something that just happens. I think he's a little bit more calculated than that.
Yeah, I thought the weaponization of migrants was a bit disingenuous, and unfortunately, it dehumanizes an already
fairly dehumanized population.
Yeah, fairly dehumanized population, and treating small Syrian children as this weapon of Putin is pretty far fetched. I think Putin had a lot of crises in Europe fall in his lap. Some he stoked, some he didn't, and never let a good crisis go to waste, as they say. So.
Assuming that it's almost a moot point as to whether it's a new Cold War or not. There's a certain type of confrontation going on, and the Russians have clearly got their playbook for how they play that kind of game. Does NATO have a playbook for how it deals with it yet? It has a playbook for the thing that probably won't happen, which is the Russians invading the Baltics. It knows what it will do then. It probably has a playbook for something that also probably won't happen, which is the Little Green Man.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it has a playbook for what's actually happening, which is more diffuse, lighter, but ongoing.
I think it's trying. The NATO-Russia Council met a couple weeks ago for the first time since I think it was 2014. And while that
not vastly successfully.
Exactly. While it was very clear that there are still some serious differences in how Russia and NATO kind of view the international landscape, I made it very, very, very clear. But I think to say, a lot of people have said this is a new Cold War. I don't think we're there yet. I think,
but it is geopolitical theater. It's in a way that it kind of wasn't in the 90s when things just dropped off the table.
Sure, but I think that going forward, NATO leaders and even Putin, I think, are open to keeping lines of communication open and trying to come up with a way to work together. While that whether or not that actually happens is yet to be seen. It's way easier said than actually done. But I don't think that we're seeing a new Cold War yet.
When the chief of naval operations had a great phrase in the New America Future of War concept, we want to be the leading experts once again in not going to war with Russia.
Sure.
Which it worked. It worked in the edgier times than this, right? The war was long and it never went hot.
Yeah, I think the problem with this phrase, the new Cold War, where it's very catchy and sexy, it doesn't demonstrate what the Soviet Union was, which was a competing vision of the world to project onto the world, from Cuba to Vietnam to elsewhere. So I think saying the new Cold War implies that the Russia we see today is sort of the next Soviet Union, and I think it can best be understood as a new imperialist Russia rather than a new Soviet Union, where its ambitions are very much regional. It's very much focused on strong-arming its neighbors, more so than
fueling regime survival.
Yeah, exactly. More so than fueling, communist uprisings in southern Africa or.
They have no. There is no appealing ideology there.
Yeah, exactly.
There is no Putinist agenda to get people going in Angola.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want to open up to any questions from the floor. Anyone have any questions? Yourself, sir. You can just introduce yourself and say
yes. Stanley Kober. I have no affiliation, but I've been writing on the NATO issue. The first article was in International Affairs in London in 1983, and this was on during the Euro missiles. There's a line from Omar Bradley. Amateurs talk strategy. Professionals talk logistics. You've touched on the money, but to my mind, not seriously enough. The 2% standard. Take a look at President Obama's budget. According to the official budget, our defense spending in 10 years will decline to 2.3% of GDP. We will barely meet the NATO standard, and we have commitments in the rest of the world. It is, I submit, impossible for the European countries to meet the 2% standard, given The Fed is going to raise interest rates, which will put upward pressure on them as well. And the retirement of my generation of baby boomers to be supported by a baby bust generation in Europe, which is now at 20% unemployment and stagnant. I do not see how you can sustain 2%.
I mean, then a counterpoint to yours is what is the utility of the 2% benchmark? So for background, all 28 or all NATO members, in theory, on paper, have to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, and 20% of that on research and development to ensure the alliance sustains its technological edge. But this is an important political barometer to showcase how serious alliance members are meeting the 2%. Currently, only 5 of the 28 members do.
And some of them are pretty creative about it.
Yeah. The
Well,
UK
Greece is one of them too.
The UK for one.
2%
Greece,
by redesignating
Yeah.
budget items.
yeah, and Greece is by 2% by default simply because their GDP is so low after the Eurozone crisis. So I actually think that NATO should really change the narrative and get away from the 2% that's really focused on input. You know, it doesn't matter what I have as long as I spend 2%. They should focus on output. And what should that output be? Instead of saying, okay, I'm going to spend 2% by the year 2025, why don't you say, you know, okay, what is our strategic airlift capability? You know, if there are troops in, you know, Denmark that would need to get to Turkey for any contingency, do we have the capacity to get them there? You know, if there's another Libya operation, do we have enough ammunition to conduct it?
Because Europe almost ran out of bombs during Libya.
Europe did run out of bombs, and they went to Israel and other countries and had to buy them sort of last minute under the table. And you know, PGMs, precision guided missiles, which are, you know, sort of the main tool in any sort of sanitary airstrike that we seem to like to do after Libya and Kosovo and now ISIS. So there are a lot of ways in which we can say, okay, maybe I'm at, you know, 1.5%, maybe I'm at 1.7%, but you know, I have troops that are ready to go, you know, in 72-hour to 4-week notice. They have adequate ammunition, they have adequate training. We have high-tech military equipment, and so, you know, that's good enough. And I think a perfect example of that is, you know, look at Greece, which, you know, they spend 2% simply because of what I said, and it's all focused on jabbing Turkey in the eye. And then look at Denmark, who spends, I think, 1.4%, and they've been involved in pretty much every international operation.
And they're much more useful as a member of the alliance than
Exactly.
less.
So I guess essentially what that means is maybe we're finding out that the 2% is irrelevant.
I mean, it's also worth pointing out, of course, that the Russians also probably can't sustain their defense spending.
Yes.
So, I mean,
Yes.
in the kingdom of the bankrupt, you know, it doesn't really matter if everyone spends less or more, or you know, it's, you know, you're you know, it's unlikely anyone is going to be spending much more. Certainly in the European theatre, China's a very different matter.
Yeah.
But you know, in the European world, probably nobody is going to be spending more. And also, a lot of the things the Russians could do, because don't cost very much money, and a lot of the things the Europeans could do don't cost very much money. I mean, it's, you know, and all of this narrative hybrid warfare stuff, however you play it, is not vastly expensive, right? And whether you spend 2% of GDP on it is largely irrelevant.
I mean, I think going forward, I mean, investing in even non-military capabilities like cyber and a big word right now in NATO is resilience. And does that mean investing 2% of your GDP in defense? It doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means figuring out ways to be resilient in the face of different threats. So yeah, I agree with Robbie. And maybe it's time for the 2%.
But the other thing we didn't mention on the logistics point, of course, is the energy issue. We did a discussion 2 weeks ago on European energy security, and the general conclusion seemed to be that Europe had moved forward over the last, say, 10 years since 2007, in building resilience, in building, you know, slightly reducing dependence on Russia, in building systems for juggling, you know, so that you could Far East Europe could survive for a couple of months without Russian gas. They've done stress testing. So on that logistics side of life, things have moved forward, right? And the energy is an important component of this in a way it wasn't during the Cold War.
And one more point, going back to 2%, is the bottom line is if NATO keeps its nuclear deterrent as the backbone of its deterrent capabilities. You know, it doesn't matter whether there are, you know, there's 1 BCT or 40 BCTs, you know, cluttered around in the Baltics. If we sustain our nuclear deterrent, then that's going to matter a lot in the long run.
Because NATO hasn't been a war-winning organisation for a long time. It's been a hold, fall back, and then blow the world up. That's how it, that was its strategy for a very long time. Right? And it's not that different now. In that it's, yes, the Russians can take the Baltics, but it's very hard to do it without ending up in a shooting war that might become incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
Anyone else got any questions? Yourselves?
Yeah, hi, Neil Walther with the German Marshall Fund. I think getting back to the 2%, it was fascinating to see Obama in the press conferences in Europe this past week. When he mentioned 2%, it's just such an annoyance, I think, to the Europeans, especially to America. I mean, they know it's coming. They kind of, yeah, you know, we're trying our best and move on. It's almost a joke, and I think it's something that it's almost a stick in the eye that's just not necessary for the United States to focus on. And what's also interesting about the 2% is that also doesn't encapsulate domestic police, intelligence services, foreign intelligence services. I mean, I think a lot of these threats that we're talking about with Russia are also going to be countered through very hard and well-financed intelligence work on the ground.
And same with threats from the South, terrorism.
Yeah, on the ground in these countries, and not necessarily just hard military assets sitting in the Baltics. I mean, you can get around that. The Russians are sophisticated operators. And so I think that's also where the 2% doesn't encapsulate the whole capabilities.
Is there any hope of moving off that number, or is it such a buzzword for NATO? And Trump has probably made this, Trump has probably made it even harder to move away from that buzzword, right?
I don't think there's a way to move away from it, because it's still public support is very much about narrative. NATO needs public support, and an easy narrative is NATO and its 2%. That's just a easy, straightforward, flat barometer. So it's hard to move. It will be hard for the wider public to move away from that, but for the policymakers, for the establishment in the capitals across Europe, if American policymakers transition away from that, like what Neil said, I think it'd be important. And another good quote is from one of the candidates, Hillary Clinton, who said, after all of this came up and they questioned, whether she was committed to allies who weren't spending their part, she said, yeah, they're not spending their part, but does that mean we abandon them? No. And I think that sums up what U.S. policy should
Anybody ask her about Vietnam?
I don't understand what you're referring to.
Well, she was, why were we in Vietnam? In effect, for NATO expansion, because of CETA. She was a Vietnam War opponent. Did she object when we pulled out?
I'm not familiar with CETA as much.
Just to get back to NATO, if that's all right. So I came in a little bit late, so forgive me if I missed something here, but you were talking about Russian violations of the Baltics airspace and the provocations. Now maybe I'll ask a provocative question. It seems like the only country in NATO that's actually done something and actually answered kinetically to Russian provocations is Turkey. I mean, having shot down the jets on its southern border. And the Russians took that very seriously, and a lot of people thought there would be escalation. There wasn't, and I think that really showed the true side of the Russians. So my question would be, and nobody wants to talk about it in DC, but where do kinetic means come into play? When do we pull the trigger, and when does that send a signal to the Russians that NATO means business?
I mean, the first point I think is really worth remembering is that the Turks lost an airplane first. The Turks had a phantom shutdown with the Syrians in 2012, and that I don't think the Turks care. I don't think the Turks cared whether they were shooting down a Russian jet or a Syrian jet. They after that happened, they went on a higher trigger. I think what it does show, and I'll pass on to the experts, say, is that imagine something like MH17 happened over the Baltic. And it doesn't really matter who shoots it down. It might be the Swedes, might be the Russians. If two countries don't want a war, they're quite good at de-escalating. I mean, KL 007 in the 80s. There's lots of examples of really terrifyingly bad things that happened that didn't spark a major war. But that doesn't mean we weren't at some stage. I mean, at some stage, the hair triggers do get pressed, right? If you wander too far into Baltic airspace, someone's going to take a pot shot at you, or vice versa. I mean,
can I just say, though, that I do think there's a difference between a Syrian missile and a Russian air-to-air combat. I think there's a distinct difference, and the Turks know the difference as well, and they know their opponent. I think that's also maybe underestimating the Turks' military sophistication.
I agree with that.
I mean, I guess when it comes to what happened in the Baltic Sea a couple weeks ago, I guess the question, I think people kind of overplay the threat of escalation sometimes. I mean, it's natural. It happens. But I think you also have to be careful because if, depending on what our response was to the Russian flyby, if we did decide to shoot down that plane, which we didn't, which was, I mean, obviously the right move. Do you want to be the one that's responsible for the first move? And if things do get escalated, do you want to be, does a NATO country, does the United States want to be the one that the Russians are not responding
I get the
to?
impression everyone wants to have their ship sunk first, right, to justify whatever they do.
Yeah.
It's kind of,
Absolutely,
you're not allowed to shoot
absolutely.
at anybody, which is a slightly uncomfortable thing. And once you've been sunk, once you've been sunk, then you're allowed to do something else. I mean, what's your take on that, Robbie?
I think that Turkey is deeply afraid of Russia. Its predecessor, the Ottomans, fought, I think, 22 wars with the Russians and lost 21 of them. And so I think there's a real deep visceral fear there that's very quiet. Crimea transformed Turkey's view of Russia. And not a lot of people paid attention to it. It wasn't very well advertised or covered, but it really did. It really was a transformational moment where before they could have an uneasy political relationship and in parallel, strong commercial relationship. And after that, it really turned the tides in Turkish views, and then Syria added to that. So I do think the shooting down of the plane, I agree with you, and I think that was on their part. They were waiting for an opportunity to make that calculated move, and maybe in the moment it was a knee-jerk reaction, but it ended up being important. I think the one difference there is that that was over Syria, which is not seen as sort of Russia's turf, and the Baltics are seen as sort of in Russia's sphere. And with the United States there, it could, there's a small chance it could quickly spiral out of control. Russia has already, rattled its nuclear saber, and so I think, there's a part of me that says, yeah, if we shot down one plane, there'd be this huge political crisis, but then everything would settle down. But in a small chance, there's not. You don't want to take that chance. So.
You had a question back.
Yep. Hi, I'm Daniel Robinson. I'm a freelance writer on Russia and the Middle East. Anyway, you touched on a question regarding nuclear deterrent. It was pretty big news in Washington last year when, in the national security strategy for Russia, they repealed their no force use policy regarding nuclear weapons. And given the fact that we've had accusations, especially the last number of years, regarding Russian violations when it comes to not only the New START Treaty, but also threats to pull out of the Intermediate Nuclear Range Treaty, I was wondering if you all could maybe touch upon developments in terms of NATO's nuclear deterrent strategy, and also if you could maybe possibly comment on just some of the financial challenges that for at least Britain and France, regarding the Euro crisis, that they've had in terms of maintaining their arsenals, and also some of the public opinion in NATO public, specifically regarding the reinsertion of tactical or intermediate weapons in theater.
Okay. Well, in terms of so let's see. There's new developments. There's NATO's nuclear deterrent, Britain, France, and then public. So I'll take them in order. So so new developments. I think the most worrying development is Russia now has a de-escalatory nuclear strike policy or doctrine. And say what you want about the Russian military, they follow their doctrines.
Can you just explain what that means?
So essentially what that means is they will launch a nuclear attack to de-escalate the situation. And they've indicated this in some of their recent Baltic exercises, such as South 2013, where they simulated sort of smash and grab attack on the Baltics, and then a de-escalatory tactical nuclear strike on a NATO flotilla in the Baltic Sea. So it was a tactical nuke, so lower yield, and it was in the ocean, so there was minimal, if no civilian casualty.
Make everyone stand down.
Yeah, exactly. So exactly the idea that Russia would ramp it up so heavily, and the United States would not be ready to risk a nuclear holocaust to save, one section of Estonia, that even if there was a lot of political fallout, the military action was done.
But that's not what the NATO treaty says, right? Once you've removed a bit of Western Europe, there's supposed to be a response.
There's supposed to be a response, but in practice, would there be response if a crisis went nuclear? I think Russia's onto something when it makes its doctrine de-escalatory. In terms of its nuclear deterrent, there's a whole section of NATO's bureaucracy devoted to the nuclear question, but they're very detached from the rest of NATO. And the reason is that, going to the public opinion, the nuclear weapons really is the third rail of NATO politics. It's highly controversial. It always has been, particularly in Germany, which, as they've mentioned, wields a lot more influence now. And so NATO does need to revamp its nuclear policy to send important signals and remind everyone that its nuclear deterrent is still in place even after 1989. But it's going to have to strike a very, very difficult political balance with the public. Britain, the Labour Party has really come out against the nuclear for dismantling.
The leader has.
Corbyn, yes. Okay. So Corbyn, the leader, who is an interesting character in his own that I'm sure Peter knows more about, has come out and said, it's too expensive to maintain Britain's nuclear trident, and that money could go, to other military means. And then I think I don't think that quite has taken hold yet, but Peter might know more about British politics, and I think in France, it's still not questioned because it's such a point of pride for them.
Oh no, I was going to ask you what you're.
I think on the British and French, the British and French nuclear deterrent, the British deterrent is part of the NATO target package. The French is not, but neither is a NATO asset. The point of both the British and the French deterrent is that NATO might go. So the French deterrent was built by de Gaulle explicitly. The message was, as a French admiral put it, "I have no quarrel with you, sir, but you must know if you invade me, I will respond with all we have, which is the nuclear option." De Gaulle said, "We want the ability to kill 80 million Russians." I don't think people lightly screw with people who can kill 80 million of their people. It's a never again weapon, and I don't get the impression that anyone in France would want to get rid of it. It's also when we buy these weapons, we buy them for 30, 40, 50 years. So for the French, I think, it's oh God, the Middle East has turned into a scary, ISIS is everywhere, we want the nukes. For Britain, it's NATO is gone, the Russians have taken Europe, the French decided to give up again, and we're surrounded. Or alternatively, something's gone horribly wrong with mainland Europe and it's turned into a horrific dictatorship. It gives us the ability to survive that scenario, and it's a dead man's hand. So essentially, if the rest of the world turns on us and wipes us out, we will obliterate millions of their people the following day when the submarine can't detect radio 4. I think there's a lot of... It's interesting. If you'd asked people 10 years ago, I think we would let Trident go. I think now in the Putin, ISIS world, Corbyn's an interesting guy. Corbyn is two things, which most British people are not. He wants to give up nuclear weapons and he's a Republican. I don't think necessarily either bars him from office. What he's been talking about is potentially building the submarines, but not buying the missiles in his term, which basically says, I think we might need this, and therefore I will spend enough money that my successor can then make the decision to keep them, which is quite bright. I mean, he's quite good, I think, at making the case. I mean, he would never try and abolish the monarchy. Everyone knows where he stands, and there he kind of leaves it. And I suspect he will fight his corner to abolish Trident, to abolish the successor program, and lose, and accept it, and make a virtue of doing so. My instinct is that the rest of Europe is in a very different position. You have, no one ever talks about it, but the American nuclear support to a variety of European countries, which is that there are nukes kept in the weirdest collection of countries you can imagine, which is Turkey, Germany, Belgium, the Belgian nuclear deterrent, which is somewhere outside of Brussels, Holland, and Italy, if memory serves, all of which have air forces that can drop freefall nuclear bombs, all of which can be handed over. in the event of war, which means that if the Russians were to nuke a German city as part of their de-escalatory strategy, my understanding, although the treaty's I think a secret, is that the US Air Force would be obligated to give release to the Russians to then be able to bomb back. The Poles are not part of this deal, the Balts are not part of this deal. I strongly suspect they would like to be, but I also strongly suspect they will never be. I mean, when you were in the Balts, did people talk about the nuclear options very much, or is it still very much the kind of within the conventional playbook?
It's within the conventional playbook, but even more so, it's within the hybrid warfare playbook. And people are talking more so about investing in non-military capabilities, like I mentioned earlier, like cyber, and just this kind of broad idea of resilience in the face of surprise aggression. Or
I mean, the one thing I would say is that a nuclear weapon is definitely a useful hybrid warfare weapon because it drifts around on the outside of whatever that confrontation is. But that doesn't mean you're going to use it. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah, Robert, I'm not precise. Finland also, but I'm not yet there as a question about Finland. But I wanted to ask you about Montenegro, and because right now I feel it's been quite quiet about Montenegro. I mean, it's going to be taken in, but nobody is. There's not a lot of buzz around. Nobody is like in that sense, and also from that jump to what the U.S. ambassador to NATO said a few days ago, but that there would not be a NATO enlargement in 4 years. So, any thoughts on this?
I mean, that's what we can expect out of the. So Montenegro has already been invited and is now joining the alliance. So that's, I think, what we're going to see out of the Warsaw Summit. When it comes to Finland and Sweden, I think there are two sides. I think a lot of people would like to see Finland and Sweden within the alliance. But at the same time, that comes with any sort of membership to any alliance. It comes with responsibilities that you may or may not want to get yourself involved in. I mean, as a NATO ally, you are therefore required to abide by the Article 5 commitment, which means that an attack against one is an attack against them all. So that the only time that that's been invoked is after 9/11. But you have to ask yourself the question: are we ready, or are we willing as a nation to get involved in situations or conflicts that may or may not directly be affecting our interest abroad? And I think that's a question that you have to ask anyone who's thinking about or would like to at some point be a part of the NATO alliance.
I think so. For background, U.S. Ambassador to NATO Doug Luke said, I think last week, there likely won't be any new members admitted into NATO in the coming years. And I think Luke committed a huge diplomatic faux pas of telling the truth. I'll leave it at that. Montenegro, right, there's not a lot of support. It's a lot of, a few very fervent, keep NATO's door open supporters that pushed Montenegro's membership through on a sea of apathy, or not membership, accession invitation.
But there's also no immediate threat to Montenegro in the way there would be for, say, Georgia or Ukraine, which would be very different cases.
So that's true, but don't underestimate Russia's ability to stoke up paranoia and fears of encirclement, including in the Baltics. And so there were a lot of high-level Russian officials, outlining how Montenegro's accession would be a grave threat to Russia. And I mean, I'm not saying there's going to be a Russian invasion of Montenegro, but Ukraine caught us by surprise, and that was an EU accession, a very technical free trade accession agreement that sparked that whole crisis. And so, the war in Georgia broke out after a NATO summit declaration that essentially said Georgia and Ukraine would become NATO members. It was just a matter of time. So don't underestimate Russia's ability to stoke some sort of unrest or violence or upheaval in countries that are becoming that are looking to become members, especially in the Balkans, where Montenegro has the potential to anchor an otherwise unstable, fragile region in the Euro-Atlantic community. On Finland and Sweden, all I'll say is I don't think they're going to join anytime soon. I don't think the public support's there, but two things. One, I think it would be impossible for NATO to reinforce the Baltics without Sweden and potentially Finnish airspace and seaspace. And the second is the current situation with Russia has driven many Swedes, and to a lesser extent Finns, in my opinion, to at least re-examine membership in the long term, which implies that the only thing that would drive them to membership is a big crisis, and the only time NATO would not be willing to accept Finland or Sweden as members is when there's a big crisis.
Well, what's your take on Finland? Do you think the last couple of years has made it more likely that it would join or less?
Well, post-Crimean debate has shifted dramatically. Before that, there was not, the debate was, it's always kept alive somehow, but, let's not talk about this. This is not a priority now. And in the 80s, saying NATO in Finland was like cursing in the church almost. So we have a lot of these people who are still, in the government. But I think our defense minister said it last year quite well. He said that hypothetically, if there would be a war between Russia and NATO, could Finland be neutral in that case, or would it be, for instance, Russian interest to take some part of Finland to defend itself? So in Sweden, I think actually it's Finland and Sweden both have said that okay, we will go to NATO together, and because that's what they did with the EU, even though the Swedes kind of because by surprise because they had already started before us. But in Sweden, it's going more rapidly, I think, because in their politics, the opposition bloc, 4 parties, they've all come unilaterally together and said that we want to join NATO. So if they go into government next time, it will go much faster, and that's what Finland needs to look out after. In Finland, the debate, a lot of people talk, we should have a public referendum about this, but the most opinion or research says that okay, if the foreign policy elite, president and the National Security Council would say that it would be in our interest to join NATO, then according to some studies, 50% of the population would support that. But if it would be right now in a referendum, maybe 25-30% would support it. But it's
and you think support is growing, or?
Oh yeah, maybe 5 years ago it was 10% less. So it's growing. It's becoming more because it's talked about more in also all these people that couldn't really talk about it before have started to be very, very vocal about it. So,
I will also say I follow some YLE polls, and I think what's significant about Finland and Sweden is not the number who have gone from no to NATO to yes to NATO, but rather the number that have gone from no to NATO to undecided, which is a much wider group that it's opened up a wide constituency that's sort of on the fence.
I think when it comes to both Sweden and Finland, even if NATO membership isn't part of their future, it is important for them to kind of know and be able to foresee what kind of requests may be asked of them in the face of some sort of aggression. And then there also needs to be a way for Finland and Sweden and NATO allies to share and process and retrieve real-time information with one another.
The Swedes in particular are already pretty close to the Balts, so it kind of feels like them. It kind of feels like the Swedes are in the modern NATO, even if they never actually join.
Yeah.
But I have to say, there's in Finland there's basically
Don't tell a Swede that.
There's basically 3 NATO narratives. One is that okay, we shouldn't provoke Russia, so that's why. Why do we want to invite them to be more militarily active on the border and so forth? And then there's this exceptionalist narrative that we think that we are the country that have had exceptionally good relations with Russia compared to other countries. The only Russian neighbor that is only non-NATO or non-former communist member of Russia from Norway to North Korea. So, and during also this crisis with Ukraine, the Finnish president has been able to, go to Moscow and talk with many times. And somehow, I don't know, I think Finnish foreign policy elite still thinks that it's nice that, for instance, Estonia and all this, they have no, there's no going to Russia and talk about things, but we can still have a dialogue with them. And then there's people that think that hey, we're an independent country, we should be able to make our own decisions, regardless. Do you want to? I mean, if you have to live in fear that somebody might hurt you, do you live with that fear even though they wouldn't do it, or do you take up the phone and go for just?
I mean, I think we'll probably wrap it up there, I think, but thank you very much indeed. That's been a really useful discussion, certainly for me, because that means I can now write about 2 or 3 columns on various chunks of NATO, European, and possibly Finnish politics. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a great discussion. Thank you very much to our excellent panel. If you signed up for this, you'll now be on our mailing list, so you'll get invited to everything else that we're doing. Thank you very much indeed, and good night.